In the late summer of 1590, Governor John White finally returned to the coast of the New World. 3 long years had passed since he had left his daughter, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, and more than 100 settlers on Roanoke Island. He had sailed back to England for supplies, but the trip stretched into an agonizing delay, prolonged by war with Spain. Approaching shore under a gray, expectant sky, his heart must have hammered. He expected to see a thriving English village, to hear his countrymen carving out a life on this wild edge of the continent. Instead, a profound and unsettling silence greeted his landing party. Small cottages stood empty, doorways gaping to the sea breeze. The structures were intact. No signs of frantic departure or violent struggle. It looked as if inhabitants had simply stepped away from daily tasks and never returned. A ghost town hung shrouded in mystery. Eerie domesticity lingered in the air. Belongings lay scattered, but not with signs of panic or raid. The scene felt less like a battlefield and more like a stage left empty, props undisturbed. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the cry of gulls and the rhythmic wash of the Atlantic against the shore. White and his men moved through deserted lanes, calls echoing unanswered. They searched for any sign of life, any clue to explain the disappearance. They found no graves. They found no human remains. The absence of bodies ruled out a simple story of disease or starvation. The settlement wasn't destroyed. It had been hollowed out. The people, the heart of the colony, had been scooped out, leaving only the shell of their ambitions for the elements to reclaim. The air was thick with unanswered questions. White noted that heavy iron bars, lead, and other valuable items he had buried were gone, dug up and taken. This suggested an orderly, planned departure, not a hasty flight. The colonists had packed up their most precious belongings before leaving. But where had they gone? And why? A community had methodically dismantled its future, gathered essentials. Before he had departed for England in 1587, Governor White had established a clear contingency plan with the colonists. If they were forced to leave the Roanoke settlement for any reason, they were to carve their destination into a prominent tree or post. He gave them a further instruction, a grim but necessary one. If their departure was driven by distress or danger, they were to carve a Maltese cross above the name of their new location. This symbol would be a silent scream, a warning that they had been forced out by violence or peril. It was a simple code, a lifeline of information across the ocean and the uncertain years of his absence. Upon his return in 1590, his men combed the silent, empty village and found the message they were looking for. Carved deep into a fortress palisade post was a single stark word, Croatoan. Close on the carving, the letters were clear and deliberate, not hastily scratched. White searched with a rising sense of hope and dread. On a nearby tree, he found CRO etched into the bark. The sight of the word was a jolt, a clue, the only one left to explain the fate of over 100 souls. Crucially, the carving lacked the symbol White most feared. There was no Maltese cross. That absence was as significant as the presence of the word. It suggested the colonists were not victims of an attack. The message pointed to a planned, peaceful relocation. The colonists had not fled in terror. They had moved. This small detail shifted the story from certain tragedy to a profound, unresolved mystery. The journey to Croatoan Island, however, was never completed. As White and his men prepared to weigh anchor and sail south, the weather turned against them. A powerful storm began to brew, churning the coastal waters into a treacherous frenzy. The ship's anchor cable snapped. The vessel was left at the mercy of wind and waves. Navigating the shallow, tricky shoals of the Outer Banks became suicidal. The window of opportunity slammed shut. The sailors were weary from the Atlantic crossing and wary of the approaching hurricane season. They refused to risk the journey. Survival took precedence over the fate of the lost colonists. With supplies dwindling and his ship damaged, John White conceded. He ordered the ship to turn back first toward the Caribbean, then ultimately back to England. He never returned to America. He died years later, haunted by that carved word and the knowledge he'd been within miles of an answer. turned away by a storm. The failed search cemented the mystery. The clue was left dangling, a thread of hope no one could pull. Croatoan became more than a place name. It became a symbol of an answer out of reach. Over the 4 centuries since John White sailed away, 3 primary theories have emerged from the mist of speculation, each attempting to weave the known facts into a coherent narrative. The first, and perhaps most optimistic theory, is that the colonists integrated with the local Native American population, likely the Croatoan people themselves. This idea is supported by the clue itself and the absence of the Maltese cross. Proponents of this theory suggest the settlers, facing dwindling supplies and the failure of their own agricultural efforts, chose to seek refuge with a friendly tribe. They would have traded their English identity for survival, slowly assimilating over the years, language, customs, even their DNA merging with that of their hosts. A second, more grim theory posits that the colonists were massacred. While their relations with the Croatoan tribe were generally peaceful, the English had previously clashed violently with other local tribes. It is possible that, after White's departure, these tensions escalated into a full-blown conflict, resulting in the annihilation of the entire colony. This theory would explain the disappearance of the people, but it struggles to account for the lack of evidence at the site. There were no bodies, no widespread signs of a battle. Some suggest the carving of Croatoan was a desperate misdirection, or that the colonists were captured and taken to Croatoan Island to be killed, their bodies disposed of where they would not be found by returning English ships. The story of the lost colony of Roanoke endures not just because it is a tantalizingly unsolved case, but because it represents the foundational myth of English settlement in America. It was the first attempt to plant a permanent family-based colony, a trial run for the nation that would one day emerge. Its failure served as a stark and cautionary tale for subsequent ventures like Jamestown and Plymouth. The lessons learned from Roanoke's mysterious fate, the need for better planning, more robust supply lines, more nuanced diplomacy with native peoples, were written in the invisible ink of its disappearance, shaping the strategies of all who followed. The tale resonates with a primal fear of the unknown, of being swallowed by a vast and indifferent wilderness. It is a story about the fragility of civilization when it is stripped down to its bare essentials on a foreign shore. The image of those empty houses, the silent fort, and the single cryptic word speaks to a universal anxiety about loss, abandonment, and the erasure of identity. The colonists were not just lost to their contemporaries, they have been lost to history itself, their individual stories, hopes, and fears dissolving into a collective enigma. They have become America's oldest ghosts, forever haunting the coastline where they first sought to build a new world.